Hi, I'm Yosefa Huber. I'm a U.S. CPA specializing in working with U.S. citizens living in Israel.
Hi, I'm Baruch Swinkin. I'm the CFO of Route 38 Professional Services, an Israeli payroll solutions company. Yosefa and I are here to talk today about a trend that we are seeing here in Israel, which is that more and more people are bringing their jobs with them in Aliyah. As we move into a post-pandemic world where the concept of working remotely becomes more and more accepted, the concept of working and sitting at your desk, whether that be in Beit Shemesh or in Jerusalem or in Haifa, as opposed to being in Teaneck or the Five Towns or Chicago, has become something that's more and more interesting to people and something that people are more and more pursuing. There are a number of different categories of people who have jobs who are bringing them over. Amongst them are someone who is employed, who would be a W-2, meaning that they have a regular job in the States that are being paid. Someone who could be self-employed, meaning that they're a contractor, which could be either a 1099 or they're a small business with many multiple clients running their own company. Or they can actually have some more formal structure like an LLC or a corporation in the States where they're running a full company. Additionally, there may be people who have significant travel plans and are going to be working somewhat from Israel and a little bit in the US, and therefore have to work out both tax reporting issues in the US as well as in Israel. With a little bit of planning, you can keep your job and make Aliyah and be extremely successful.
What kinds of planning questions do we ask? So we start by asking, what are you doing now? If you already like the job that you're doing, or the kind of job you're doing. Are you an employee for a U.S. company where you get a W-2, you're legally their employee? Are you a subcontractor where you work for only one firm or two firms, where you get a 1099 at the end of the year? Maybe you work for a few different firms. Whatever you're doing, if you want to keep doing that, usually the default is that you come to Israel and you open a tax file, a teek, we call it, a tax file, or files in Israel, and then you report all of the income that you're getting to Israel. Usually, please, you would want to use a professional Israeli accountant for that, preferably someone who specializes in working with Olim. And then, of course, you continue reporting all of your income to the US forever. But what are some considerations? Some of the considerations are double taxation. Can you avoid it? If you can avoid it, is it worthwhile to avoid it? Sometimes it's not. Simplicity. Can you simplify your life? Do you really want to set up something very complicated? There are, of course, lots of legal issues. The thing to keep in mind is that you don't get to choose your residency. A lot of people ask me what address they should use on their tax return, or they call me and they say, oh, I'm a New York resident. Well, if you're living in Israel, you're an Israeli resident. If you go to sleep at night in Israel, your whole life is in Israel except for your job or whatever, your mailing address. You don't get to pick that. So you can use whatever mailing address you want, but taxation is going to be based on where you're doing the work and where you're living, where you actually go to sleep at night.
The first type of individual that we discussed before was a W-2 employee, meaning that an individual who had a job in the States was getting paid regularly via a pay stub every 2 weeks or bi-monthly. And the simplest solution for that individual would be to open something called a Tik Nikuim, which is a payroll tax file. It's really simple and straightforward. All you need is to hire an accountant to help you with it, and all the information that you get from the company in the States will be given to you. You'll be filing with the various agencies in the country, and you'll be good to go. It'll be a fairly seamless transition. It's important to note that in that situation, both you and the company are going to be paying full deductions in both countries, which is something that the company is going to have to be aware of. But it's also extremely important to note that although this is the simplest solution and maybe the best solution for the individual making Aliyah, the vast majority of companies will not knowingly agree to this because it exposes them to potential Israeli tax liabilities. And it's something that, in general, most companies, if they do not have to open up a tax file in a foreign jurisdiction, will never, ever do so. Mm-hmm. And therefore, as easy as it is the least common solution for anyone making Aliyah with their job.
Yeah, it is very rare that a company that you're working for is willing to open a whole tax file in Israel, unless they have a lot of employees who are moving to Israel. So you might think you just want to quit your job or switch to being a contractor, but before you make any changes, please speak with a professional about your personal situation, because there are several factors to consider, and you really want to talk with someone individually. Some of the considerations are, do you want to continue paying into U.S. Social Security? Are there benefits that your current company are giving you as an employee that you wouldn't be able to get if you weren't an employee, and you need to find a way to keep those? And are you going to create a legal issue for your company? So some of these things we discuss on a personal level, and there are a lot of subtleties here. I think our goal, both of us, is that people can keep their parnasa, and that's a big part of having a successful Aliyah. So both of us work with people to try to help them keep that without hopefully opening your company up to legal issues. So whether you're already a 1099 contractor or you want to switch from being an employee to a contractor, what do you need to do in Israel?
So really, there are 2 or 3 different approaches that one can take. On the Israeli side, the classic approach is to open up an independent tax file called a tik atzma'i, which Yosefa referred to earlier. What that means is you're going to hire an Israeli accountant. They're going to open files with all the various agencies that are necessary. And you are going to be reporting just similar to the way that you reported in the States. You're going to have periodic reports over the course of the year and an annual tax return that's going to have to be filed. It's relatively simple and straightforward if you understand the rules and are prepared beforehand to ensure that you are able to note the differences between specifically about some of the Israeli reporting concerns that are different than the US reporting concerns. For example, some things you may be used to from running a business in the States is that you can just submit a credit card statement to your accountant, and that is enough to be able to record the majority of your expenses on any given month or during the course of the year. That does not work in Israel. In Israel, you need to keep every single one of your original receipts and submit every one of those receipts to your accountant in order to get credit for the expenses that you want to be putting through. Additionally, not every expense that is expensable in the States is expensable in Israel, and it works the other way around as well. For example, things such as meals and entertainment, which are expensable in the States, at least a certain percentage of those are expensable in the States, are in almost all situations not expensable here in Israel. So it's really important for you to do your due diligence, to research beforehand, to really understand some of those differences so that when you get to the end of the year and you're getting to your reporting time for your annual return, you don't get surprised and say, well, I thought all these things I put through were going to be deductions on my return, and now I'm finding out that it's just really wasted money. There are many different designations that you may hear about within this category of an independent contractor in Israel, and it's going to be important for you to understand all the different distinctions, the thresholds, and the implications of each of those different situations. Just to throw out a couple of those terms, they're going to hear the term osek petor, and you're going to hear the term osek morshe. They each have different ramifications, and it's important to discuss this with your Israeli accountant before you open your tik in order to make sure that you are prepared properly and planning accordingly.
One of the main differences between taxes in the US and Israel is that in the US, you can just start working. You don't have to tell anybody. As long as you're keeping good records, you can keep records almost however you want, use whatever software you want. In Israel, there's specific regulations, especially for certain industries, about how you keep those. So ideally, you want to be speaking with an Israeli accountant in Israel before you start working. And in many cases, you'll need to open tax files in Israel before you start your business. For some people, especially those with modest incomes, it may make the most financial sense to stick with the default of being self-employed in the US and Israel. Self-employed being you're not setting up any additional companies or registrations. That's the default. And for many people, that's the only solution. Yes, you will be paying double taxes. Yes, you will be filing taxes both to the US and Israel. You'll be paying into both Bituach Leumi and Social Security. But at some levels of income and for some people's professions and lifestyle, it's just not worth it to do anything else. If you already own a company, then you probably are going to want to do some more sophisticated tax planning to decide if it's beneficial to keep that company open and how best to use that. So you'll likely combine multiple planning elements, and some of which we'll talk to, but it really is important to get personalized advice, your specific situation. Some of the things that will be considered are how much work you're doing in the US physically while you're while you're visiting the US versus while you're sitting in Israel, how much assets your company currently has, and that would include intellectual property and goodwill. So an Israeli accountant or in some cases an Israeli attorney could help you determine what planning structures are best.
Okay, so that brings us to the second. For Olim who don't already own a business and are coming with some type of a classic type of a job where they're getting paid, there are 2 primary strategies used to legally avoid double taxation of Social Security. Again, if a person wants to pay into Social Security and believes that that is a sound investment for them, then maybe this tik atzma'i probably is the simplest solution for them and maybe the way to go. But if you would like to avoid paying both into Social Security as well as a Bituach Leumi, there are 2 primary solutions. The first is called an EOR, or an Employer of Record Service. You may hear these services referred to as a payroll company, a PEO, a manpower company. All of these things colloquially mean the same type of thing, although there are very distinct differences between all of these different designations. The way that this works is that the company in Israel will hire you as an employee of their company in Israel, which allows them to process on your behalf all of your tax and social benefit obligations. And they will then contract with your former employer or client in the States or anywhere abroad to ensure that the company in the States has a separate company that they are going to be dealing with and are not dealing directly with you anymore. You are no longer an employee of the company in the States. This solution allows for a relatively seamless financial transition and allows for the individual to really come off the plane and really start working, moving directly from being employed by their former employer in the States and now being employed by their new employer here in Israel. It's also a very easy way to fund your account here in Israel in shekels. Sometimes if you do open your own business over here, specifically as an atzma'i, or have no other reporting devices over here, it can be challenging to move money over, or expensive at least, to move money over from dollars to shekels, and this is a very simple way to do so. The reality is that this entire service is meant to be set up as the most hassle-free and headache-free as possible. What it really means is that once you land here, you start working, you're going to get a pay stub every single month. It's important to note that in Israel, employees get paid monthly, not bi-monthly or bi-weekly. And it means that you will really have no other further reporting requirements here in Israel, at least for this income. If you have Israeli passive income, or after 10 years other foreign passive income, you will have to report that. And if you do hit a ceiling of 611,000 shekels per year in annual revenue, you will have some other further annual reporting requirements. But otherwise, you can come here, you can sit, and you can work, and you don't have to worry about anything here in Israel whatsoever. It is important to note that you will, as Yosefa mentioned before, continue, one of the beautiful presents that Uncle Sam continued to give us is that you will continue to have to report for eternity to the U.S., but you should not be paying any other taxes or social benefit requirements.
Using an EOR service can allow someone with all the legal and tax benefits of being an employee for an Israeli company while continuing to perform services for whoever they were working with back in the States. For example, maternity leave and other social benefits. If you continue to be an employee of your U.S. company as a W-2, you may not be eligible for all the same benefits. Since since you would be an employee of a non-U.S. company, not outside the U.S. and not a self-employed person, that also gets you out of your FICA taxes. So you won't have to be paying your Social Security and Medicare taxes. And it also can simplify things. Your Israeli EOR, which is your new employer, handles all the withholding. So you don't need to be hiring, as Baruch mentioned, you don't necessarily need to have an Israeli accountant and do annual reporting.
Sometimes, though, the company in the U.S. may not want to work with an EOR because it is an outside solution and they're going to have to contract with an outside company and they may not be comfortable doing so. Or you may be earning enough income that it's not worth it for you, or there are other more viable financial solutions for you and structures for you to be able to maximize your income here in Israel. And therefore, there's another solution that is a little bit more sophisticated that is usually required, and that is the solution to open up a Chevrat Ba'am in Israel, which is a corporation or an LTD here in Israel. The advantages of opening up a company in Israel are, first of all, that you become your own employer, and therefore you, again, avoid the FICA tax, the Social Security tax that we discussed before, and therefore you have no double taxation. It gives you the maximum amount of flexibility in terms of expenses and processes. You have many more things that you can expense that are maybe mixed personal business items, such as a car or a home office or things of that nature, which at least a portion of those expenses can be put towards your business and therefore save you a little bit of money. Probably the biggest advantage you can have of opening your own company is the ability to keep money in that company, not pay yourself everything out in payroll, and use those earnings either for some type of pre-tax investment or some other business purpose while being taxed at the lower corporate tax rate as opposed to a higher individual tax rate. This gives you really maximum flexibility in terms of what money you pay yourself and what money you can keep on the side and how you can spend your money in the best way possible. Additionally, it allows you to deal directly with your employer or client from beforehand. Oftentimes, an individual will make Aliyah and move, and the employer will give them their blessing, but they're not necessarily excited about that, and they, as I said before, don't want to deal with another company. This allows you to structure your own contract for your own needs, for your employer's own needs, and you don't need a middleman who has their own processes in the middle to kind of muddy the waters a little bit. You have direct contact the entire time with your clients, and it's a very straight and efficient relationship.
That probably was one of the most popular solutions, or the most common solution for U.S. citizens once they reached an income level where they no longer wanted to be putting in Social Security. But it has gotten more complicated every single year, at least since 2017, has gotten more complicated. The primary downside of incorporating in Israel is the time and energy that's required to manage your corporation, especially for new olim. You're dealing with enough challenges. And so even if financially it could make the most sense, or even legally if it could make the most sense, you're always going to be weighing that with do you want to own a company and do you want to deal with. But the accounting fees are significantly higher. So once you're running the numbers, most people find that until they hit certain income thresholds, which is, it really depends on the situation, but around about 40,000 shekels a month, around $12,500 a month, depending on what you're doing. Before that, it's not usually worthwhile to look at incorporating because you might be paying your accountants, both your U.S. and Israeli accountants, about 10 times what you would if you were an atzmai, or especially if you were an employee. Israel requires much more extensive reporting and auditing for corporations compared to certain other small business structures. And the U.S. requirements, there were quite a few pages of reporting that needed to be done every year. It's called Form 5471 or 5471, where you have to report your ownership of a foreign corporation. But in the past few years, we also have what's called GILTI. It's an acronym. It stands for Global Intangible Low Tax Income. Doesn't really have that much to do with what it sounds like it should have to do with. But in short, if you leave money in your company, you expose yourself to double taxation. That's a very short explanation, but it definitely reduces some of the planning options that U.S. citizens had previous to GILTI with leaving money in the company. So it's really important to get expert advice so that that's all planned properly to reduce or completely avoid the GILTI tax. And I think the most important consideration is, are you the type of person who's ready to run a business? There are solutions where you can pay people more and more to handle that stuff for you, but know that you have to at least be on top of making sure that gets done, because just the U.S. penalty alone, if you're late filing your tax return and you have a requirement to file that form, there's a $10,000 penalty, automatic, and it can be pretty hard to get out of. So you really want to make sure that you have an Israeli accountant and bookkeeper who are on top of it and not waiting till the Israeli deadline, because that won't work for the U.S. And you are really going to need a specialized U.S. accountant. It's not something that most U.S. accountants are qualified to handle. And even within the field of international taxation, I have to admit there are less and less accountants doing it as it gets more complicated and there's more to learn each year.
One area that we have not yet touched on are people who will be undertaking significant travel overseas. Well, this was much more common in the earlier stages of Aliyah, when people came and they kept their jobs in the U.S. and didn't have the technological solutions that we have nowadays in order to make that happen. It's still something that is relatively common and something that needs to be addressed. For the first 10 years of your Israeli residency, much of the income earned while physically abroad does not have to be reported here in Israel, and it's a very important point to note. That can simplify things here for you tremendously, because you can travel for the first 10 years to the States if you travel once a month for a week, if you travel for summer vacation and you are working while you are there. The earnings that you have while you are physically there do not have to be reported here in Israel. However, obviously, they still continue to have to be reported on the U.S. side. What are the implications for someone who's doing this who has to continue to report on the U.S. side?
So, of course, you'll continue to be required to report all of your income and, in most cases, financial accounts to the U.S. every single year. And you'll have to make a calculation between income earned in the U.S. versus income earned in Israel. If you're earning income both places, it's generally advisable that your Israeli and your U.S. accountant work together to coordinate and make sure that there's an agreement, hopefully, on who's taxing what. And in many cases, you are also paying tax to one or more states if you're going back to work in a state. If you're working for completely separate employers, for example, let's say you're a doctor who works for a hospital in the one hospital in the States and a completely separate, Kupat Cholim or a hospital in Israel, and you're getting separate wage statements, then that's much simpler. There's not a whole lot of calculating to do because your W-2 from the US is showing all of the work that you do while you're in the States, and your 106, your Form 106, which is kind of the Israeli equivalent, shows hopefully all the work that you've done in Israel. So as long as you're not doing any remote work, then there may be no reason to file an Israeli tax return, and the complications wouldn't be too complicated.
So now that we've gotten towards the end of our presentation and you've been listening to Yosefa and I speak for the last 20 minutes on technical accounting jargon, we thought it may be interesting for our viewers here to be able to hear from a real-life story, a first-person account of someone who has recently made Aliyah, gone through this process, and has come out on the other side, thank God, very successful. We have asked Danny to join us for a few minutes to give you a taste from start to finish of how he was able to make his dreams come true.
Hi everybody, my name is Daniel Ackerman. I'm a graphic designer in Oleh Hadash. I made Aliyah almost a year ago, last summer, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about my journey bringing my job to Israel. Like most of us, in the middle of COVID 2 years ago, after being locked down and working remotely, we realized these things are a possibility. It could happen. You can move to Israel. You might not know how it's going to work, but it's a reality. And so after calling Nefesh B'Nefesh, I remember the day I picked up the phone, so I decided to make Aliyah. Where do I start? I got all the paperwork out of the way, and after the general application came the big elephant in the room, the financial side of what to do with your job, with your salary, shekels, dollars. It's very confusing. People are throwing terms at you, Keren Hishtalmut, Bituach Leumi, speak to an accountant. It's very overwhelming, and so you have to take it step by step. A lot of what I did was research, and going into this with open eyes, you have to leave no stone unturned. And what I recommend the most is going straight to an accountant that knows the Israeli tax system and the US tax system. I spoke to an Israeli tax accountant first, then I spoke to a US accountant. I spoke to Israeli financial planners, American financial planners. I really tried to do my homework because at the end of the day, you might be in a position where you're the first one to do it, like myself, and you have to be curious. No question is a bad question because this is completely uncharted territory. And what you're really doing at the end of the day is like radically changing a lot of what you know and what you've always known most of your life, especially the financial side of things. So to do your homework, and again, to go straight to experts that know both sides of the system. I mean, I've had accountants that I really trust and I've used for many years, but they might not know the Israeli side. And so you kind of have to take the plunge and trust someone that you may not have spoken to before. And again, do as much legwork as possible to bring them all the information that contextualizes your unique situation, because everyone's is different. Everyone is going to tell you, you have to do this, you have to do that, you should speak to this person. But at the end of the day, it's going to be unique for you. The more information that you have will actually help others help you. You're gonna get so many options thrown at you. Maybe you should be a 1099. Maybe you should open up your own company in Israel. Maybe you should stick with your W-2. We heard a lot of these solutions before from the experts that were just on. And so what's great is to just take all of this into account, figure out how it could work for you, how it might not work for you. After you get off that phone call, summarize everything, send it back to the accountant, ask him to tweak what you may have not heard correctly, maybe even just record the session and listen to it again once you get off the phone. All these things help reinforce it and helps you choose the right solution that works for you. I just want to wish everybody a lot of hatzlacha with their Aliyah planning, and just know that all you really need is a willingness and a desire to navigate this territory, especially financially. It could be very scary at first, but once you put one foot in front of the other, you'll see that a lot of people want you to be successful. And my sitting here is really just a testament of all the incredible financial experts that have encouraged me along the way.
Thank you, Danny. Danny is just one of the many heroes who have taken the leap and been successful. Much of that is due to his pre-Aliyah planning and research. As you have heard over and over again throughout this presentation, both from Yosefa and from myself, it is extremely important to find out your options, to seek out expert professional advice from someone who knows and understands the Israeli-US dynamic and can provide clear guidance. It is All too often, both Yosefa and I field questions or hear stories from clients who have come to us and told us that their accountant told them to do such and such. And we ask them, was that accountant here in Israel or in the US? And they say, well, it's my family accountant I've been using for many years. And unfortunately, that family accountant may have taken a course or two in international accounting, but does not have familiarity with the US-Israeli dynamic. It's important you seek out professional advice from someone who can give you that guidance. It's important you do your research as much as possible beforehand. And if you do so, you'll be able to slide in for a seamless financial Aliyah. Of course, Yosefa and I are available to answer any questions that you may have. And for any questions that we can't answer, we are more than happy to direct you to the right address for those that we are not expert in. Feel free to send me an email to info@route38.co.il, and someone will get back to you quickly. I want to take the opportunity to thank Nefesh B'Nefesh for giving us the ability to make this presentation. And Yosefa, I want to thank you for sitting with me. It's been a pleasure and an honor presenting with you. How can people be in touch with you?
You can go to my website. It's www.huber.taxcpa.com. I also have information on my Facebook page and my YouTube channel. And if you send me an email, I'll point you in the right direction.